All right, welcome back, everyone. Nice to see you, and great to have you back here on this virtual screen, learning Rashi together on a daily basis on this very snowy Monday. Hope you're all staying safe and staying dry. We're going to learn Rashi from the second Aliyah today in Parshas Bo. Exciting Parsha. We get to the last of the Makos. As the Torah here in the beginning of the Parsha, first two Aliyahs really introduce us to the seventh Makkah, the Makkah of Arbeh. We already had the first seven in Parshas Va'era, and now we have a couple more over here, three more in this Parsha. So the Torah begins by, again, having Moshe Rabbeinu going to Paro, asking for the release of the Jewish people, threatening the Makkah of Arbeh. But in the second Aliyah, we actually see the Makkah arrive, the plague arrive. Vayomer Hashem Moshe netei yadcha al eretz Mitzrayim ba'arbeh. Because Paro wouldn't release us, so we have this command from Hashem to Moshe to place his hand upon the earth and have Arbeh come out. Vayal eretz Mitzrayim, it will come out on all of Eretz Mitzrayim. Vayochal es kol esav haaretz asher es kol asher yishir habarad. Anything that the barad, the hail, didn't destroy, the Arbeh, the locusts, are now going to eat. Vayed Moshe et Mateo al eretz Mitzrayim v'Hashem nihag ruach kadim v'aretz kol hayom. Moshe and Hashem in partnership bring about this Makkah. Moshe places his staff and Hashem brings the wind, and all of the Arbeh come all day, all night. The wind brings the Arbeh in. And then description of what actually happens over here. Torah tells us, Vayal ha'arbeh al kol eretz Mitzrayim, Vayanach bechol gvul Mitzrayim. It not only comes, but it rests, Vayanach, in all the borders of Mitzrayim. Kaved me'od, this is a very heavy plague of locusts. Lefanav lo hayachen arbeh kamohu, v'acharav lo yechen. Before this, there were never a plague of locusts or an attraction of locusts or an attack of locusts in this way before, and never again will there be. It's always dangerous when the Torah makes those kind of statements. Maybe dangerous is the wrong word, but bold. When the Torah makes those kinds of assertions, there never will be, there never was. This type of phraseology occurs multiple times in Tanakh in various locations. And every time it occurs, the Mefarshim struggle to understand what exactly it means. Because if you look at other places in Tanakh, there are other psukim and other stories which seem to go against this principle. So Rashi quotes one of those instances right over here. Okay, the fact that there never was an attack of locusts like this beforehand, that perhaps we can buy. But the fact that Torah says there never will be an attack like this ever again is difficult, not because even any empirical evidence that we have or archaeological evidence that we have, which Rashi is speaking already about in the Middle Ages, but because of psukim in Tanakh itself. Ve'oso shahaya b'mei Yoel, shenemar bo. What about the one in the time of Yoel? The Sefer Yoel in Treasar describes a terrible attack of plagues which come in his time, which he prophesies about. It says over there, Shenemar Bo, it says about the plague of locusts in the time of Yoel, Kamohu lo niya min ha'olam. There never was an attack like this ever before in the history of the world. Well, then what does that mean over here when our Torah tells us, Achrav lo yechen? There never will be an attack like this ever again. So how do you square away these two instances? On the one hand, the Torah telling us this is the worst of the worst. There never will be one like this again. And then in Yoel, the Navi telling us that the plague that happened in that time, or the attack that happened in that time, was unparalleled in the history of the world. How could it be unparalleled if the Torah tells us that the plague in Mitzrayim was the worst that would ever be? Limadnu she'aya kaved mishal Moshe al yedei minim harbe shahayu yachad. You have to answer and say that there was something distinctively different about the two plagues of locusts, the two attacks, so that you can say, well, this one, this type, was the worst of this type that ever occurred. You have to delineate them a little bit. You have to separate them a little bit, because if they're just lumped together in the general assumption of an attack of locusts, then you can't say these two psukim coexist. You can't say on the one hand that the Mitzrayim one was the worst ever, and that the Yoel one, there never was one like it before. You have to differentiate between them in some way. So the way that Rashi differentiates between them is saying that the one in the time of Yoel was worse in some ways than the time of Moshe, because there were minim harbe shahayu yachad. There were many kinds of locusts that had gathered together in this attack. There was arbe, chsil, yelek, gazam, all these different forms of attack. Aval shel Moshe min echad. By the time in Moshe's time, the attack in Egypt, there was only one species of locust. It may have been a lot. It may have been very heavy. May have been very difficult to sustain. It may indeed have been the worst plague, a worst attack of locusts of a single species ever before in history and ever again in history. But by the time you get to the plague in the time of Yoel, there is a multifaceted attack of locusts of all different species that never was before in the world, even in the time of Moshe. Because in the time of Moshe, it wasn't the same kind of attack. It wasn't a multi-species attack. It was a singular species attack. Now, you can weigh which one is worse. Was the fact that in the time of Moshe, there was one species, but it was very, very heavy, worse in terms of the results, in terms of the attack severity, than the time of Yoel, where there were many species? That you could already judge about, whether it's true, it's not true, one is worse, one is not worse. But at least we squared away the psukim, claiming that each of these instances was the worst ever, because what they're really saying is they're the worst ever of their subset, of their type, of their sort, of this particular kind of attack. So in the time of Moshe, we could say acharav lo yechem. With certainty, we can say in a singular type of species of locust attack, there never was one like this ever again in history. And in the time of Yoel, we can say in terms of a multi-species attack, there never was one like this ever before, because the one in Egypt, which was considered worst up till now, was a single species. Kamohu lo niyeh velo hiyeh. There will never be one like this again in terms of the severity of a single species attack. I tell you this less in order to understand the various kinds of attacks of locusts, and Baruch Hashem, I don't think we experience these kinds of attacks today or have anything to compare it to, but more just in terms of methodology.
Well, Rabbi, that's not quite true. There was a major locust attack in Ethiopia in 2019, 2020.
Right. Interesting.
I mean, it was just, it covered the entire country.
Yeah, good to know.
Kenya and Ethiopia. Huh?
Good to know. I didn't know that. I guess I've never experienced the locust attack, but that's good to know. I guess just in terms of a point of reference, it would still be hard to compare, I guess, which is worse and whether it matches up to the time of Yoel, time of Mitzrayim. But yes, I guess that's true. Thank you, Steve, for pointing that out. Baruch Hashem, I personally have never experienced a locust attack, but I'm sharing this with you more in terms of methodology, right? So how does Rashi, how does the Mefarshim, how do Chazal grapple with inconsistencies in the text? And I think what you see here is a basic premise of Parshanut, of interpretation in terms of Tanakh, which is that the baseline is that the Torah is true and the Nevi'im are true. And if you have something that on the surface seems like it's irreconcilable, you have to figure out a way to reconcile in terms of the text, because the baseline assumption is that there is truth over here in all of these prophecies and all of these psukim of the Torah and of Tanakh. And I think that may be obvious to all of us here on the call, but it's something important to point out nonetheless, because it's not the underlying assumption of every discipline that studies Torah or studies Tanakh, or of every segment even of our community that studies, but it has to be an assumption that we come in with. It's what Rashi started with, it's what Chazal started with, it's what many of my teachers, rebbeim, professors, others start with in many disciplines, not only in terms of Parshanut, in terms of archaeology, in terms of science. There are many things we discover that seem to be against the Torah, against Psukim, where you find internal contradictions in terms of the Torah or Tanakh. And, if you come at it with the attitude that this is truth and that there must be an explanation, then you look for it. Maybe you find it, maybe you don't. But at least your faith remains intact, because your baseline assumption is that there is truth over here, as opposed to saying, well, every little piece of evidence I can find perhaps chips away at the truth of the Torah. A very important perspective I think Rashi had, Chazal had. So take a look at the way that Chazal solved the contradictions in Sefer Koheles and all of these kinds of things. It's the same methodology, but it just continues forward. Have a great day, everybody. Stay safe.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi. I'm going to send you an article about the locusts.
Okay, great. Thanks, Steve. Have a
You're
good
welcome.
one. Bye, everyone.